mental health will be outstanding for this group. And I just wanted to give a warm welcome, a warm Long Beach City College welcome to all of you. Thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul, Dr. Creason. And my husband wanted to say a few words, Dr. Maté, before you start, and he has to also go for an event. Go ahead, honey. I don't know where you are.
Oh, I'm just right in the corner here, babe. But let me see your lovely face. Oh, there you are. There you are. Well, let me salute my dear brother, Dean Paul Greason, for his leadership. And it's always a joy to be with my beloved wife. She's just such a force for good in scholarship and poetry. And of course, she means the world to me. And both of us recognize that anytime we get a chance to spend time with the international treasure, my dear, dear, dear brother Gabor, Dr. Maté, he has been at it. He's in his 9th century, 80-something years, and he's still on fire for truth, on fire for justice. He's got that unique fusion of Socratic humility on the one hand, but prophetic witness on the other. So he's not just a towering scholar. He has a heart of gold. And you know how rare that is in the academy and how rare that is in life in general. So you all are in for a treat. And my dear brother, I just want to apologize with you. I've got another class here, but I just, when my wife told me that you were actually going to be here in the flesh, I said, oh my God.
I'm just so sorry that when you come to Vancouver, I'm already tied up that night. What a dog.
No, because I'll be there, what, in a night and a half, giving the Edward Zaid lecture, and you're already tied up. But I'm taking your spirit with me, just like my spirit is in you right now, my dear brother. I love you. I respect you. God bless your loved ones. And Bay, have a wonderful time, and all your students are blessed to work with you and study with you in such a wonderful way. You all stay strong now. Stay strong.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, honey. Thank you for your time and your words. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. West.
Lecture.
No, indeed. Salute you all.
Okay, everyone. Thank you again to Dr. Kristen and Dr. Cornel West. I wanted to start by introducing Dr. Maté. I know we don't have that much time and everybody wants to hear from Dr. Maté. And I will ask everyone to please put yourself on mute. Honey, you are still here. Oh, okay. I was trying to tell my husband to make sure he left. Dr. Gabor Maté is a retired physician who, after 20 years of family practice and palliative care experience, worked for over a decade in Vancouver's downtown east side with patients challenged by drug addiction and mental illness. The best-selling author of 5 books published in 43 languages, including the award-winning The Realm of Hungry Ghosts, Close Encounters with Addiction, as you see in my library of Dr. Maté, is an internationally renowned speaker, highly sought after for his expertise in addiction, trauma, childhood development, and the relationship of stress and illness. For his groundbreaking medical work and writing, he has been awarded the Order of Canada, his country's highest civilian distinction, and the Civic Merit Award from his hometown. Vancouver. His most recent book, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture, is a New York Times and international bestseller. And it's also a book that we are studying in my classes, Dr. Maté, for the past decade and a half. My own work has been immensely impacted by you and your work. You have changed the way I look at how I treat my patients for mental illness and addiction disorders. My students have been impacted by you. So I cannot thank you enough for your work, your commitment, and for your generosity to be here. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. 2 questions before I start. One is, I keep hearing a ringing, I think, when people sign in. Can that possibly be silenced?
You know, I cannot control the Zoom anymore. I have a co-host, Professor Kim Branch, and so maybe he can silence the ringing.
Yeah, do you hear that ringing every time?
I do.
Yeah.
I'm
Well,
going to work on it, Dr. Maté. I'm going to work on silencing that.
okay, thank you so much. The
Of course.
second question is, what am I talking about tonight? Did you want, did you
Yeah.
want me to talk about addictions? Did you want to talk about trauma and
Well,
mental health in general? Which one did you want to cover?
So the program that I teach within the Allied Health Department
Good.
is addiction studies and mental health. We study the impact of trauma on mental health and addiction.
Okay.
And we also address a lot of applications of treatment, intervention. We have
Okay.
been studying your work, and yes, anything that you can, you
Okay.
want to talk about, I'm sure we all benefit from it.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you so much then.
Of course.
I will begin. So, as mentioned in the introduction, I was trained as a family physician, and every once in a while, somebody says, "Well, he's just a GP. What does he know?" But what's really interesting about that comment is that as a family physician, you get to know people, and you get to know people in the context of their families, and you get to know people in the context of their multi-generational families. Whereas if you go see a psychiatrist, they only see you when you're already sick. They don't know you before you got ill. And same with any kind of a specialist. And certainly addiction specialists only see people once they have succumbed to some kind of addiction, usually substance addiction. So from that point of view, uh, being able to observe people in the context of their lives is a huge advantage. Number one. Number two, unfortunately, in a lot of medical training, and I'm talking now about across the board, they ignore a lot of science and a lot of research that doesn't fit in with the reigning medical ideology. And the reigning medical ideology tends to be biological, so that it reduces everything to biological events largely. So addiction, if we're going to talk about addiction, is considered to be even such a forward-looking person as Dr. Vivek Murthy, Vice Admiral Vivek Murthy was your recent Surgeon General. When he published his white paper on addiction, I think 4 or 5 years ago, it says 40 to 70% of addiction is genetically determined. I think that's nonsense, and I don't, and there's very little science behind it actually. But again, it has to come with this idea that everything is biologically sourced and genetically inflected. And so the first book that I wrote, Scattered Minds, was attention deficit disorder. And again, this is supposed to be a genetic disease of the brain. It's said to be the most heritable genetic mental illness, the most heritable mental illness there is. It's really interesting. The New York Times this last weekend, on the cover article of their magazine, had an article on ADHD refuting all that stuff, showing that new science has shown that there is no ADHD gene. And there's a large nebulous group of genes that if you have them, it might increase your risk of ADHD, but they don't dictate it. And so that this kind of science gets produced all the time, but it doesn't seem to affect the medical ideology. And so what I'll have to tell you today is based on three sources, I would say. One is my observations and experience as a physician, my deep reading of the scientific literature, um, and including on trauma, on brain development, on the physiology of mind and body, and also my own experience as a human being. So since this is, let me begin with ADHD, not because I want to talk much about it, I don't, but as an example of what I'm referring to here. And by the way, ADHD is a major risk factor for addiction, for reasons I'll talk about. And maybe, well, what's going on? How come? Well, it's very obvious how come if you actually understand human experience and the science that is available to us. So my book Scattered Minds on ADHD was published in 1999, so talking 26 years ago now. And I'd been diagnosed with the condition in my mid 50s, early to mid 50s. And Within a few months, so were a couple of my kids. And this seemed to be the classical genetic family history example. If the father's diagnosed, the kids have it, it's got to be genetic. Well, I never bought into that for a very simple reason. Because the hallmark of ADHD, which is the tuning out, the absent-mindedness, is not a disease. What is it actually? Well, what it is actually, it's a coping mechanism. Dissociation of various degrees is a coping mechanism. When the circumstances are dire and you can't escape it or change it, then the organism resorts to its default defenses. And dissociation, tuning out, is one of them. Emotional shutdown is another. There are others. And but what I didn't know then was the science of brain development. So let me talk to you about that now for a moment. But except I'll mention that those of you that are familiar with my history, you know that I was born Jewish infant, spent my first year under the Nazi occupation, nearly died, survived. But we had a terrible time, and my mother was very stressed, and as you can imagine, and it's just a physiological fact that when mothers are stressed, babies are stressed. As a matter of fact, not just babies. We've known for many years, decades actually, that children whose parents are stressed are more likely to have asthma. And not only that, the greater degree of mental distress of the parents, the more medication for asthma the child will need. In other words, the parent stresses translate into physiological changes in the child. And if you want to know, according to one study, if you want to know if a marriage is stressed or not, you can do two things. One is you can ask the parents, or you can measure the cortisol level, the stress hormone level of the children. Now, so there's a stressed infant. What do I do? I can't change the situation. I can't ask for help. What do? I tune out. But when am I tuning out? When my brain is developing. And this is just what people don't get, is that people say to me, are you saying addiction is not biological? Are you saying that ADHD is not biological? Everything is biological. If I sneeze, that's biological, obviously. But the biology is inseparable from life experience. So I'm going to quote now from an article that was published in an obscure journal called Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Pediatric Academy, the American Academy of Pediatrics, from a obscure little university called Harvard. And this was published in February 2012. And they summed up decades of brain research. Now, this stuff was already known in the 90s. So it wasn't new. By the time they published it, by the time Harvard put out this very seminal paper as a summary of child development and brain development, and pediatrics published it, this information had been around for a long time. It had not yet penetrated the medical schools, and it still doesn't penetrate the medical schools. So I'm going to read you 3 paragraphs from this article, and this pertains to everything I have to say about mental health conditions, mental illness, and addictions, and ADHD, and just about everything else. So this is from Pediatrics, February 2012. This is from the abstract. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, the way kids adapt to early stress helps them endure the stress, but they become sources of dysfunction later on. And so This is what I've been saying about tuning out ever since I found out about ADHD. It's not a disease, it's an adaptation. But when is this adaptation being utilized by the child? When his brain is developing. So how does the human brain develop? In other words, what shapes the biology of the human brain? If we're going to talk about biological psychiatry or biological explanations for mental health conditions, let's at least consider what shapes the biology. So I'm going to read you two sentences from this same article. Here it goes. And I'm going to read it slowly and I'm going to repeat it. The architecture of the brain is constructed to an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. That sentence again. The architecture of the brain is constructed to an ongoing process that begins before birth. That means that the emotional states of the mother are already affecting the brain development of the child. And we know that mothers who are stressed during pregnancy, I mean, it's not even vaguely controversial. Mothers who are stressed during pregnancy, their kids are more at risk for ADHD and addiction and other mental health conditions. I could go into the physiology of it. I just don't have time, but I could if you want me to. So it begins before birth, which also means, as I say in the appendix to In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, the prevention of addiction needs to begin at the first prenatal visit by looking after the emotional needs of the mother, at least by giving her support. No doctor is trained to do that. We look after the blood pressure, the weight gain, the physiological parameters, the ultrasounds. We never ask, we're not trained to ask the woman, how are you feeling? Do you have support in your life? Are you stressed? What's happening in your life? That's the first sentence. So it begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Not some of the health, learning, and behavior, all of it. And that's the first sentence on brain development. The second one is the interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. In other words, the physiology of the brain, which brain chemicals will be present, or which circuits develop, what connections are made, which systems develop, and how well are they integrated to one another, depends on the emotional environment of the child, his, her, their relationship to the nurturing caregivers. So when we look at the biology of the adult brain, we're looking at the impacts of childhood experience. So there's no separation between life experience and biology. And by the way, that's a lifelong process, that our brains are very much affected by our environment and our interactions. And of course, the younger we are and the more our brains are in the developmental phase, the greater those effects. So what I'm saying is, what I figured out about ADHD is, okay, here's a problem. That what happened was that these genetically sensitive kids, they weren't born with any condition, but they're genetically sensitive, uh, which is why they have more asthma as well and eczema and so on. Then you put them in a stressed environment, that's going to affect how their brains develop. It's genes interacting with the experiences. That's as much as I'll say about ADHD now. But that's when I first began to cogitate on these matters, is when I wrote that book and I began to look at brain development. Now let's come to addictions. So, as mentioned in the introduction, for 12 years I worked in what is North America's most concentrated area of drug use. It's the downtown east side of Vancouver. People coming from anywhere in the world, including Detroit, New York, or the Tenderloin of San Francisco, or Los Angeles, are shocked at what they see here in Vancouver in the streets. I was the physician for 12 years there. Um, and I've often said that if the success of a physician is to be measured by the health or longevity of their patients, then I was a complete failure. Because my patients with HIV, hepatitis C, mental health conditions, They died of overdoses, suicide sometimes, accidents, violence, infections of their brains, heart valves, joints, whatever, spines. And then I began to look at their lives. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But before I do, let me give you a definition of an addiction that I don't think anybody can argue with too much. So an addiction is a complex physiological, psychological, or physio-psychological, and even spiritual process that is manifested in any behavior in which a person finds temporary relief and pleasure and therefore craves, but then suffers negative consequences as a result of and does not or cannot give up despite the harm that it's causing. So craving pleasure relief in the short term, harm in the long term, not giving it up, not desisting despite the harm. That's addiction. Now, notice I said nothing about drugs. It could be substances, obviously, and often it is, from the legal and lethal substances of alcohol and cigarettes to the um, illicit drugs like cocaine, crystal meth, and the various opiates, either plant-derived or laboratory developed, circadian or caffeine. You can do any of that, but it could also be sex, gambling, shopping, pornography, eating, self-cutting, work, the internet, cell phones, gaming. Did I mention gambling? Any range of human behaviors. The criteria is, does it give you temporary pleasure or relief? Does it harm you or people around you? And can you give it up at will? If you can't, you've got an addiction. Now, I've given talks to thousands of people. I mean, thousands at a time. And as I will be on a tour of Eastern United States starting next week. And I give them this definition. Then I ask people, if you've had an addiction in your life, any kind of addictive pattern according to that definition, just raise your hand. Virtually everybody puts their hands up. And that's just universal. And if I did that with this crowd, I'm sure I get the same response. But then I ask, not what's wrong with the addiction, but what's right about it? What does it give you in the short term that you appreciate? And people will say, it numbs me. Well, who needs to be numbed? Somebody who's in pain. When you go to the dentist, they numb your teeth, your gums, the nerves in your mouth. It relieves stress. It soothes the pain. It makes me feel more alive. It gives me a sense of control. Well, loss of control, isolation, lack of vitality, distress that you can't handle. These are states of emotional pain. Hence, my mantra, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. Because that came first. In other words, the addiction didn't arise as some kind of a genetic disease. It was a response to a life problem. It was an attempt, a doomed attempt, a self-defeating attempt to solve the problem of suffering. So don't ask why the addiction, ask why the suffering. That's the first point. The second point is, let's look at the physiology of it. And I'll come back to this question of trauma and suffering later on. And I'm just going to check my time here because, yeah, I want to leave lots of time for questions. So let's look at the brain in addiction. So you have these opiates. Opiates are either derivatives of the opium plant or they are artificial copies. No. In medicine, we've been using opiates, particularly opium, for at least 3,000 years, according to Chinese medical texts. And they're the most powerful pain relievers that we have. So when I worked in palliative care, looking after dying people, oh boy, was I glad for the opiates, because people would suffer horribly without it. So they're pain relievers. But why is it that a plant that grows in Afghanistan and in its vicinity. Um, why does that work in the human brain all over the world? Well, the reason is that we have receptors for the opiates, and receptors are molecules on the surfaces of our cells that can receive messenger molecules. So the opiate is the messenger, then there's the receptor. We have receptors all throughout our bodies for opiates in our guts. That's why opiates make us constipated. Or that's why when people withdraw from opiates, they have diarrhea. Um, they're working on the immune system, but I'm not going to talk about all that stuff. Just going to talk about the brain and and the opiates. Why do we have opiate receptors for a plant in Afghanistan? Well, of course, as all you know, we don't. We have receptors for our own internal opiates that are called endorphins, endogenous morphine-like substance. And it was Dr. Candace Pert, the great American researcher, who first intuited and then found the opiate receptors. And she wrote a wonderful book called Molecules of Emotion. Now, what I'm saying is, if we want to understand why people use opiates, let's understand what our natural opiates do. What do they do? Well, first of all, they relieve pain. Not just physical pain, but emotional pain. The so-called placebo effect is not a placebo effect. It's an opiate effect. When somebody thinks they're getting help, that releases endorphins. If you block the endorphins, they will not get the placebo effects. So it's not an imagined effect. It's a genuine physiological effect. About 20-25% of people, they're given an inert subject, told that they're giving morphine, but it's a placebo, they'll still get pain relief. And you can block that with opiate blockers. So their first task is pain relief, and not just physical pain relief, but emotional pain relief. Because in the anterior cingulate cortex, there this is where we experience the experience of pain, physical or emotional. And that part of the brain is suffused with opiate receptors. So they're pain relievers, okay? Now, the second effect is pleasure and reward and elation. So when you're joyful and elated, you got endorphins happening in your brain. And if you can block that, if you block the opiate receptors. Now, the third effect happens to be the most important one. Opiates, the endorphins, facilitate a little thing called love, without which human life is impossible. So as the great neuroscientist, affective researcher, Dr. Jaak Panksepp showed, we have systems in the brain for various emotions that we share with other animals, other mammals, including for caring. Another word for that is love. And endorphins help to make that happen. Now, a few years ago, in 2017, under the first Donald Trump administration, you had an attorney general called Jeff Sessions. And Mr. Sessions gave a talk about addiction. And he said, we need to prevent addiction. We have to prevent people from making these bad choices. In the 1980s, Nancy Reagan had this program saying, just say no. And Mr. Sessions said, let's just go back and revivify those programs telling kids not to make these bad choices. Well, so, okay, Mr. Sessions, let's put signs on the highway that say, just say no to pain relief. Just say no to love. Just say no to pleasure and reward. And how successful those programs have been can be measured by the fact that in the United States over the last several years, every year, more than twice as many people die of overdoses as died in the Vietnam, Afghan, and Iraq wars put together. That's how successful those Just Say No programs, based on the idea that addiction is some kind of choice are. Okay? Just say no to all that stuff, Mr. Sessions. All right? Another brain circuits involved in addiction are the dopamine circuitry. Dopamine is an essential brain chemical. It facilitates what Dr. Panksepp called the seeking circuitry, which is curiosity, seeking, exploration. Dopamine flows when you're seeking food, seeking a sexual partner, when you're exploring a novel environment, a novel object, which is essential for human life, for any mammalian life. And that's when dopamine flows. And we have dopamine experiences when we're highly motivated, when we're curious and seeking and just really alive. Okay, Mr. Sessions, let's just say no to curiosity, vitality, and a sense of being alive. Let's just put a sign on the highway saying, just say no to all that. There are other circuits involved in addiction, the impulse regulation circuitry of the brain, which tells you that you may have an impulse to do something, but don't do it. Well, these circuits and other circuits, they have to develop. No child is born with them. They have to develop properly. And development is a matter of conditions. Now, I quoted to you the Harvard article on brain development that it happens beginning before birth, continues into adulthood, and its genes and experiences much potentiated by the emotional relationship of the child and their caregivers. Now, what is the experience of severe substance addicts or almost any substance addict and many other addicts? Well, in the downtown east side, I've often said, for 12 years, hundreds of women, not a single one had not been sexually abused. Not one. And the men had suffered horrible, many of them sexually. And now trauma has many effects. Addiction is one of them. I don't say that everybody traumatized becomes addicted, but everybody addicted was traumatized. Which is a different, trauma can show up in the form of physical illness, other mental illnesses, dysfunctional behaviors, or in the worst case scenario, some company accepted, you become a politician, and that's how it shows up. And actually, if you study the histories of a lot of these people that seek and are addicted to power, they have highly traumatized childhoods, which is just a fact. But what I'm saying is that if this is only my observation, it would be interesting, but maybe not persuasive. But there's been large-scale studies, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, including the California-based adverse childhood experiences studies, which showed that for each childhood experience, such as sexual, physical, emotional abuse, a parent dying, a parent being jailed, a parent being mentally ill, a parent being addicted, violence in the family, neglect, a rancorous divorce, for each one of these, the risk of addiction goes up exponentially. So does the risk of ADHD, psychosis, autoimmune disease, and so on. And I could talk to you for hours about all those connections. But what I'm saying is that whether we're looking at addiction from a biological point of view, in which case we have to factor in the impact of life experience on the physiology of the brain and the body, or whether we're looking at it as a psychological experience of people experiencing from pain, you have to look at their lives and what gave them the pain. Now, those adverse childhood experiences are the most dramatic form of people being traumatized, but it's not the only way. Trauma means wound, and kids can be wounded not only if bad things happen to them, but also if their needs are not met. Now, in the United States, as human beings evolved, infants and children were with their mothers throughout the childhood. And in Aboriginal societies, you know what the average age of weaning was? 4 years. In North America, 25% of women have to go back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth, which amounts to a massive abandonment of the country's infants. Do we wonder why there's so much ADHD and so much mental illness and so many troubles amongst our kids when we abandon them? Let alone the dysfunctional parenting advice given where parents are told to ignore their parenting instincts and ignore the child's cries. Well, that's wounding a child. What message does the kid get? That he doesn't, she, they don't matter. They're not seen, they're not heard, they're not held. So I could talk at length about the needs of children that this society really undermines or doesn't meet. But our point is there are many ways of children being wounded. Now, is there nothing genetic here? Yeah, there is, probably, but not exclusively. So some kids are more genetically sensitive. And sensitive means from the Latin word sensere, to feel. They feel more. So that the example I always give here, I just hit myself on the shoulder. I felt no pain whatsoever. But if I wasn't wearing clothing and my skin was bare and there was a burn there, so the nerve endings were close to the surface, which means I was thin-skinned, as that expression goes. And if I hit myself with the same force, I'd be in excruciating pain. And sensitivity is largely, I think, genetically determined. So the more sensitive a person, now that's why, by the way, so many artists and so many creative people, jazz musicians, are also addicted, because it's that same sensitivity that gives them that creativity that also makes them hurt more. Obvious link. As to the link between ADHD and addiction, they both have to do with dopamine. They both have to do with early stress. Of course, there's a big overlap. And there's no mystery if you understand anything about human development. I'd like to stop soon and maybe take some questions on the mouthful that I've already sent your way, and then we'll see if there's more time for other things to say. Except I will argue that virtually any mental health condition is rooted in trauma. There are some rare diseases that are genetic, not to mention a mental health one, but a physical health one, muscular dystrophy. It runs in the family. In my family, if any generation anybody inherits that gene, they get the disease. But those diseases are very, very rare. Huntington's chorea, which can result in mental dysfunction as well as physical one, that's genetic. If you have the gene, you'll pretty much have the disease 99% of the time. That's very rare. So let's take depression as an example. What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. Literally, that's what it means. What is pushed down in depression? Emotions. People are flat. We talk about the flat affect. Why do people push down their emotion? Because at some point they learned that the emotional expression of all the emotions that a child will have, joy, fear, pain, um, playfulness, anger, are not acceptable. And so they push it down as a matter of adaptation. And furthermore, as Dr. Panksepp, whom I've quoted, points out, when there's separation, the child experiences grief. We have circuitry for grief, and the child experiences grief. And if that grief is not resolved, that sets the ground for depression. So it's all a matter of life experience, which also means, on the good side, that life experience can also help heal people. So I'll stop here.
Oh, wow. I tell you, Dr. Maté, we can listen to you for hours.
So could I. So could I, actually.
Everything you were talking about, it's such a fresh review of what we actually study based on your literature as well. The suppression of the feelings, the basic needs, emotional basic needs not being met. We talk about small capital T trauma, small T trauma. It's lovely to hear it from you directly. I feel like I want to ask you 25 questions, but I know my students will kill me. So I'm going to start with those who raise their digital hand. That's the only way I can see you guys. Raise your digital hand. And I have brilliant students, Dr. Maté, so you're going to see. And so keep your questions to questions. And I see Yvonne and then Caleb. I see Oscar. I see Brad, Sandra. So Vaughn, you go.
So there's just one more thing I want to
Yes.
add first, before the first question.
Yes.
To those adverse childhood experiences, we need to add racism and poverty because they've been shown to affect brain development, and of course, they're very stressful.
Mhm.
So, in the downtown east side of Vancouver, a large percentage of my patients were Indigenous Canadians. In the jails of Canada, 70% of the women in jail are Indigenous. They make up 5% of the female population. And I don't have to tell you, United States, you get similar statistics. So that color, so-called color, is a, I never understood why people call white people, because, I show you white. This is white. Now, I'm a white person. Do I look white to you? For God's sakes, what does it mean to be a white person? But anyway, that aside, um, so racism is a huge factor, uh, and oppression, and so that it's not just individual, these are social factors as well. I mean, there was one study, never mind mental health conditions, one study that showed that the more experiences of racism an American black woman has to endure, the greater her risk for asthma. And colored women especially have much higher risk of autoimmune disease of all kinds. These are not genetic things. These have to do with the biology of trauma, and addiction belongs in that category. Okay,
Thank you.
I'm ready for
Thank you.
questions.
Yeah, we were actually studying in class the working with African American, Black American population today. So that's fascinating that you're also addressing that. Vondrell, your digital hand has to go up before I can see you. I did call on you. Okay, so unmute yourself. Go ahead, Vaughn.
Hi. Thank you, Dr. Maté. Appreciate your insight. I had a question, so when you were kind of like describing the parameters of addiction, like one of the things you use to describe it as like a spiritual problem, which, that I found very interesting. So with that being said, and as far as a solution, like what is your take on spirituality and how it interacts with like someone recovering with addiction?
Sure. If you look at the, thanks for the question. If you look at the North American indigenous concept of the medicine wheel, it's got four quadrants. Um, it could be the four directions, the four seasons, but it could also be the nature of human beings. So there's the mental, which are our emotions and our thoughts. There's the physical. There's the social, which is our relationship to other creatures. And then there's the spiritual, which is our connection to the universe and a sense of belonging. So when I talk about spiritual, I'm not necessarily talking about religious. I mean, some people find spirituality in religion. Some people have religion without any spirituality whatsoever. Um, but spirituality is this sense of oneness, unity, belonging, connection with something larger than just a little ego. So when the 12-step movement talks about the higher power, they they tend to put it in sort of Christianized religious terms, but of course it doesn't have to be. It could be nature, it could be a broad concept of God, whatever that is for you. These are words that everybody uses, but everybody has different connotations for them. So, but anyway, by spirituality, I mean a sense of belonging to something greater than we are. I think it's a crucial one because the addict feels totally isolated. Because of the trauma, one of the impacts of trauma is that people feel so alone, and they feel so ashamed of who they are. And there's no forgiveness for them. And so that spiritual sense of belonging and that something greater than we are, and yeah, we can look to something beyond ourselves, I think is crucial, not just to addicts, to any human being, whatever form that takes.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you so much.
Thank you.
Caleb?
Hello. First off, thank you, Dr. Maté, for being with us. I have your book.
Sure.
in the realm of Hungry Ghosts, which good stuff, came highly recommended to me. So yeah, I had a question about kind of preface question. Are you familiar with the Family Crucible?
But who?
The Family Crucible, August Napier.
I'm not.
Okay. Augustus Napier, he's a marriage and family therapist, and he worked with married couples, and the tact that he took was mm, mm, mm. very direct, right? In terms of compelling ownership over one's behaviors, personal responsibility of one's actions, and how they affect other people, right?
Yes.
So I think that's something that we see a lot in individuals that have like especially extensive trauma, is
Yeah.
that as a result of the trauma that they experience, people develop adverse behaviors to cope with the trauma. Drugs and alcohol are obviously an example of that, but it can also include things like sex addiction or violent behavior.
Exactly.
And as a result of these behaviors, people over time will cause harm, and they'll
Yeah.
negatively affect the lives of others. Often, what I see in my profession is with great difficulty taking personal
Okay.
responsibility for
Listen.
their behaviors.
I Carlos or Caleb, sorry, I get what you're saying. What's the question?
Okay, thank you. So the question is, what are your thoughts about assertive
First,
therapeutic methods in the treatment of
okay.
trauma?
Okay, so here's the deal. Um, Ultimately, nobody can heal unless they take responsibility for their state. That's true. Okay. But it's a question of how we encourage people to take responsibility. Now, the reason I was looking at my cell phone as you were talking wasn't out of disinterest, but I was looking for a quote. Okay. I'm going to read you this quote now. And this is by Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who's a neuroscientist. You guys might know his work at Stanford University. And he wrote a book last year or the year before entitled Determined. And by determined, he doesn't mean as in committed, but as in predetermined. And here's what Robert says. He says, we're nothing more or less than the sum of that which we could not control, or biology, environments, and their interactions. There's no such thing as free will, and blame and punishment are without any any ethical justification. And Dr. Panksepp, who I've quoted before, also says that because of their long-term influences, we often have little choice but to follow the emotional dictates that well up from ancient regions of our brains. As in so many aspects of life, emotions lead the way. Now, yes, we do have the prefrontal cortex with its capacity for decision making and for response flexibility so that when something happens, we can choose which response. But in traumatized people, especially when they get triggered, the prefrontal cortex goes offline. So we talk about people losing it. What do they lose? Self-regulation, capacity for insight, capacity for rational decision making, and the emotionally driven, trauma-inflected, primitive parts of the brain take over. So there's no room for blame here. And when I take this, the 12 steps, again, say, the moral inventory, look at what you've done, look at what you've done to others and take responsibility. I think that's great. But the question is, how do we get people get to that point? Not by saying this is your job, you have to do this. In my mind, that doesn't work. You have to say, what happened to you? What impaired your decision making? What pain are you harboring? Can we help you with that? Can we help you develop responsibility? Can we help you develop response flexibility so you don't act automatically? Can we help you develop awareness so you have more freedom? Because Dr. Sapolsky is right so much of the time, and it takes work, and it takes awareness, and it takes conscious will, and a lot of compassion to help people develop that capacity for self-responsibility. That's my view of it. Okay?
Thank you, Dr. Maté. Thank you. Oscar?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Mahdavi. Dr. Maté, I want to say thank you very much for being here with us today. It's an honor, a privilege, and an inspiration to be here learning from you today, sir. But I just wanted to quote what you said was that addiction is a coping mechanism, temporary relief for stress, relief, trauma, a response to a life problem, a self-defeating attempt to solve a life's problem. I definitely wrote that down in my quotes right here. And especially what you're talking about, how artists have like they obviously for the most part must have some type of trauma in order for them to be doing that type of work. It makes
Sorry to interrupt, but I didn't say that.
okay.
It may look
So,
like it. I think you can be a great artist without trauma.
okay.
All I'm saying is that the reason so many artists are also addicted of mental health issues is because the same sensitivity that gives rise to their art also makes them suffer more. But they would have been great artists even without the suffering. They just might have done different kind of art. So I don't think suffering as such is a requirement for art. I don't believe that, but
Yeah, I think
I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I just wanted to clarify what I did mean by that. Do you want to continue with, sorry?
No, sir. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you then. Thank you.
So everybody, I know there's a lot of hands up, and because time is limited, please just ask your questions, and let's allow Dr. Maté to answer you, and we all will benefit from that. Brad, please go ahead.
Thank you, Doctor, for doing this for us. My question is what you think about the use of ketamine or ganglion block to address trauma and addiction, and if that impedes one from dealing with their trauma. So that's it.
Okay, so thanks for the question. I mean, I've worked with psychedelics over it's a whole other story, but about 15 years ago, after the publication of my book on addiction, I became aware of psychedelics as a potential modality. And there's a whole range of psychedelics, from the plant-based ones like peyote, the mescaline-based one, the ayahuasca from the Amazon, or iboga from the Gabon in Africa, mushrooms, of course. By the way, let me tell you something astonishing that maybe you don't know, but it's worth researching if you want to. Iboga, which is a plant that grows in Gabon, has been used ceremonially and shamanic and ritual practices for hundreds of years. It's got the amazing quality of somebody could be on heroin for 10, 20 years, and they do an extract of iboga once or twice, 2 nights running, and they'll have no withdrawal symptoms from their opiates. There's nothing like that in Western medicine. It's illegal in the United States. No, they can't even research it, so they're doing research. Like Stanford is doing research in Mexico. And iboga also helps people deal with their traumas. So a lot of veterans are going down to Mexico to deal with their PTSD and their addictions. Now, specifically about ketamine, the reason ketamine is in such wide use these days isn't solely due to its value, although some people really believe in it as a trauma treatment, but also because it's the only one that's legal. So ayahuasca and iboga and LSD and MDMA, these haven't, not even close to, maybe MDMA perhaps, are close to achieving legal status. Ketamine is legal, so it's used. I will not declare myself an expert on the use of ketamine. I'm not overly impressed with it from what little I know about it, but I know it can help some people. And why not try? Ganglion blocks, I've read about them, know nothing about them. I have no opinion. So sorry, I can't give you a more specific response than that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maté. Sandra, I see your hands up. Oh, I lost
Hello?
Yeah, keep your hand up so I can see you.
Oh, yes. Okay, there we go.
Go ahead.
All right. Hi, Dr. Maté. You emphasize how early childhood experiences and the infant maternal bond shape us deeply. For adults who may have not received attuned parenting, how can we build that self connection later in life?
Right.
Thank you.
You read my books.
Yes, they are.
Okay. Well, okay, that was a facetious answer. You know what? The good news is that the brain can develop new circuits later on in life, and that's called neuroplasticity. But again, neuroplasticity means the capacity of the brain to develop new circuits in response to new experiences. That means you have to have new experiences. So when I teach my therapeutic program, which is called compassionate inquiry, the relationship and the attunement of the therapist with the client is the most important variable. Never mind the specific technique or modality. It's the presence and the compassion and the attunement. Um, People can also tune with themselves. You know um, what meditators do is they observe their own minds without judgment. Basically, they are tuning with themselves. So meditation in some forms, there's many different types of meditation, obviously, but in some forms, meditation is a way of attuning yourself to yourself. Just observing yourself compassionately with curiosity without an agenda. Nature, um, it's just naturally harmonious when you get out into it. So people, especially like indigenous people in Canada, but around the world, they heal by going out into nature. And we've kind of got away from that. But that's a great practice. In other words, there are ways, it's never over. And as somebody once said, it's never too late to have a happy childhood, which actually means
You some kind of double E. You're fucking shit up.
it's not that you revise the past, it's that you revise your relationship to the past. Because the capacity for healing, like even if you use this, I've often said this, take this word called recovery. That's what we use, right? What does it mean to recover something? It means to find it. When you ask people, when you recovered, what did you find? You know what they say? I found myself. They reconnected with themselves. So that self is never gone. And it may take a lot of work and a lifetime of work to reattune yourself with yourself, but it can be done. It needs work. I mean, that's the key here. And it needs resources, which not everybody has. But everybody can meditate. Everybody can talk to some friends about their stuff. Everybody can go out into nature. Um, if you have friends that'll listen to you and hear you and see you, well, that could be very healing as well.
Thank you so much. And we do have a few other people. I saw Professor Branch had a question, but I don't see Professor Branch anymore. Are you here, Professor?
I am here. Thank you. I'm going to give the students an opportunity and I'll come back and
Okay.
because I'd love to have an opportunity to speak with Dr. Maté. Thank
Of
you.
course. Thank you. Krista, go ahead.
Hello, Dr. Maté. It's an honor to have you here tonight. My question is, how can one become conscious of the trauma narrative in the mind?
Can you say more about that, please?
Gosh, I really don't know.
What do you mean by that? Purely a game, okay? If I said that was the stupidest question I ever heard, how'd you feel?
Hot.
And what else?
Nervous.
What else?
Anxious.
What else?
When I turn the camera off.
Okay. All right. Now, Would you feel some shame at all?
Embarrassment.
Embarrassment, yeah. Okay. Now, I'm still playing a game here, you understand?
I understand.
Thanks for playing along. What if I said, I love the purple color of your hair? What would you be embarrassed?
No, I'd be curious because it's not
Why?
purple.
Why? Because it's not purple, is it? And if I kept insisting that your hair is purple, what would you think of me?
Might be a little silly.
Yeah, what would you think of me if I kept insisting?
Um,
This guy is either
Goofy.
off his rocker or he's colorblind, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, why would you then respond with shame, embarrassment, and nervousness when I said that this is the stupidest question I ever heard? It's no more true than my statement that your hair is purple. That's a trauma imprint. So how you respond to what other people say. Because if you're as confident in yourself as you're confident in the reality that your hair is not purple, you say, what's this guy talking about? So that's one example, okay? So the trauma imprints narratives show up whenever we're triggered. Now, trigger is an interesting word, as I've often said. How big of a part of a weapon is a trigger? It's this big. But there's ammunition there, there's explosive charge. So if you get triggered, if I get triggered, it's because we're carrying the explosive charge. The trigger is just the external little thing. So it shows up when we're triggered, it shows up in the stories we tell, it shows up in the shame, it shows up in some of our automatic beliefs about other people. Above all, it shows up in our relationship to ourselves. It shows up in the relationship choices that we make. So it shows up in many, many ways. So how can you become aware of them? When anything is uncomfortable in your body, there's something going on. And you can ask, what am I telling myself right now? So that's a good way to begin.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I see Jan Salas. Oh, hi, Jan. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Mahdavi West, and thank you, Dr. Mate. My question is, we use a lot of medication-assisted treatment, and I was wondering because it's supposed to manage cravings, and these are opiate blockers, some of them like Vivitrol, and we use that for alcohol, um, for managing cravings. So I was wondering, because we need the endorphins, is it counterproductive to use these
Well,
medications?
some medications combine some opiate substitutes with some blockers as well. Look, if the person is freely choosing the treatment, and if they're saying that this injection keeps them from drinking, that they may get it every 2 weeks or once a month, I don't think it's counterproductive because it helps them go to work on the issues. It helps them develop. I mean, with medically supported treatments, I have no problem whatsoever. What I have a problem with is that they're often the only treatment many people receive. So they don't get help to deal with their traumas. But what if while they were abstaining with the help of these medications, they also were supported to get to like themselves, to get to understand themselves, to heal those traumatic imprints? Not counterproductive at all.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Heather, I see your
Hi.
hands up.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Dr. Maté. My question is kind of medication related, in particular Ritalin.
Yeah.
So if a child's given Ritalin at the age of 5 and takes it for 10 years, do you believe that that child is predisposed to stimulant use? And could that be a trauma of its own
Thank
that
you.
could leave lasting effects?
Yeah, that's been argued both ways, that if you treat kids, they won't be so dysfunctional as to become addicted, but also that these substances can be addictive, which they can be. I would suggest you read two things. One is in the New York Times this past weekend, on the front cover article of the New York Times Magazine, there's a big article on ADHD, including the latest research that fundamentally refutes all the assumptions that people have been made about ADHD for decades. And in many ways, without mentioning them, they don't know about me, but they validate pretty much everything I said in my book, The Scattered Minds. Um, the medications help behavior. They don't much help academic success or learning. That's what the research shows. Kids who are giving stimulants for a long time tend to be shorter at the end of their growth. They lose about an inch in height. That's what the article said. Um, I have very mixed feelings about kids being given medication because, as the article also points out, as I can toot my own horn, as I argued 26 years ago now, these kids are so sensitive to the environment. Let's change their environment. Try and change the biology of their brains. They're very responsive to the environment, and that's what needs to change. How we treat them, how we talk to them, how we see them, how we understand them, how we attune with them. That's what they need much more than medication. And no child, I don't know, did you say a 5-year-old? I don't want to see a
Yeah.
5-year-old.
No, it's just as an like if I know someone who was given that from age 5 to 15, that is now an adult that had a stimulant problem.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a million reasons why they get a stimulant problem. For one is a significant percentage, as I mentioned, so ADHD is a risk factor for addiction, and probably about 30-40% of stimulant addicts actually started off as ADHD kids.
Mm.
But it's not so much necessarily that the medications made them addicted, it's that the trauma that caused both the ADHD and the addiction hasn't been healed. So
Okay.
they're still self-medicating with the stimulants. So it's not necessarily that the Ritalin made them addicted. It's that Ritalin did nothing for their emotional development, did nothing for their intellectual development, did nothing for their self-concept, taught them no skills whatsoever. And now they're self-medicating with stimulants. That's how I would see it.
Thanks, Heather. Thank you. Professor Kimbridge Sword, I think I'm going to ask you for your question as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahdavi West. Dr. Maté, thank you. It's an honor being here with you. Thank you so much. My question, I have so many questions, but of course I'm going to ask one. My question for you is based on the connection of trauma and addiction and the etiology of addiction or the connection to trauma. What are your thoughts about one starting or experimenting with drugs, discovering an alternate universe that leads to addiction in the absence of trauma? What are your thoughts of that? I'm trying to phrase this, or do you believe that addiction can result from experimentation and the discovery of an alternate universe with the absence of trauma?
Well, thanks for the question. No, actually, I don't. If you look at the statistics, most people who try most drugs never become addicted. Something like 90% of people who try crystal meth don't become addicted to it. So who does? You know? And by the way, who needs an alternate universe? On God's green earth, with all that's available to us, in terms of the possibility of connection with nature, connection with life, connection with other human beings, connection with oneself, who requires an alternate universe? Somebody who's very uncomfortable in this one. Now, I've seen people do psychedelic medicines like ayahuasca, and if you want an alternate universe, boy, does that give you an alternate universe. But for the most part, and if it's in the right context, it's in a healing way, and you're not impelled to keep using that substance. Who'd want to anyway? It tastes terrible. It makes you throw up. But what I'm saying is, there are some people though whose lives are not satisfactory, who can do these psychedelics not in order to learn about themselves, not in order to reveal their minds, not in order to grow, but in order to escape. And then they become addicted not to the drugs so much as to the experience the drugs gives them or the medicine gives them. I've seen a few examples of that, but rarely. So again, the answer to your question um, is, Professor Branches, is contained in the answer is contained in your question. Who is the one that needs an alternative universe, and why do they need that? Why do they not want to come back to this one?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Dr. Maté.
Thank
And
you.
just as a codicil to that, I do run into people who say, "Oh, I had a happy childhood and I'm still addicted." Usually it takes me 3 minutes. So people can have very rosy pers perspectives on their childhood, but they're not in touch with the pain that they had. And I've done that a million times now. I've yet to find anybody who was addicted or had any mental health issues who, after 3 minutes of conversation, still thought they had a happy childhood. It's just a question of asking a few questions.
Jimmy, I see your hands up.
Yeah. So my question to you, doctor, and thank you for being here, is the use of psychedelics in therapy.
Yeah.
To what extent and how would they benefit, and in what areas?
Well, there's been a lot of research on psychedelic therapy. There's been a whole raft of books published about it, and more are being published all the time. Anybody who's worked with psychedelics clinically, like I have, I've seen what they can do. By the way, not what they can do, what the person can do with the support of psychedelics in a safe, supportive, and expert context. Because, Freud said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. They reveal what we're carrying. So dream analysis is a big deal in psychoanalysis. Well, psychedelics are a road to the unconscious because under the impact, like say under MDMA, I've seen people experience the fear that they've been running away from, and the emotional pain arises that they've been running away from, but they're not afraid of it anymore because the amygdala, the fear center, has been soothed. So now they can see what they've been running from, and they can see how all their dysfunctional adaptations and behaviors are not necessary if they can only understand and experience themselves. So there's nothing mystical or woohoo about this. It's just the fact that people can confront in a positive way all the stuff that's inside of them. And all the psychedelics, one or the other, can do that. Some of them give you spiritual experiences. I've had deep insights. I've not had big woo-hoo spiritual experiences. But there's been a lot of research on psychedelic assisted therapy, MDMA specifically, ketamine now. People used to study LSD and showed some pretty interesting results, but then that was with the war on drugs that became illegal. So the very least I would say is that they're worth considering, and they can be much more powerful than as an aid to the healing than any Western medications. And Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, sums up that information pretty well. Let's have a whole lot of other publications before and since. So there are no panacea. Some people should not do them at all. They can create harm as well. That's why the context is so important, that it's conducted by people who have integrity, who have knowledge, who have presence, insight, and compassion. Given an experience, given all that, they can be very helpful in many cases.
Thank you. Jason?
Thank you, Dr. Maté. You were talking about how the abandonment issues that we have because when we're in childhood, the families break up, go back to work in an early thing. Dealing with a lot of people that I deal with the hopelessness that, the population of the people, they feel, it doesn't matter what I do, my voice don't count, my vote don't matter. Why do I have to even bother? So how, as a counselor, how do we be able to help change those minds to let them understand that, what, they do matter, and when they're not accepting sometimes to the spirituality of the part of their life?
Okay, thanks for the question. I don't advocate changing anybody's mind about anything. Okay? I advocate creating an environment where the mind can develop new perceptions and new understandings. That's different than me trying to talk you into something. So that's the first point. The second point is you say to them, I get it. You've had no experience of being listened to. You've had no experience or very little experience of your will and your intentions making any difference. And especially when you're small and helpless, you had no experience of that whatsoever. Of course you see the world that way. It's a perfectly valid way to look at the world, given what you've experienced. I get it. You're right. But you're no longer that child. So can we talk about how we can help you move beyond that childhood experience? Now, by the way, in this process, if you listen, guess what experience you're giving them? What experience are you giving them?
But here to listen.
Yeah, you're giving them exactly what they didn't get. So just by your presence, not by your clever words, but just by your presence and your willingness to validate their experience and their emotions and to be there with them and to get it, you are giving them a new experience that they never had before. That's how people change their minds.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much. We
Dr.
talk about,
Maté.
thank you, Jason. We talk about it all the time, that there is a component of healing in the process of being heard, being seen, that therapeutic relationship, the process rather than the outcome.
Exactly.
Thank you for reminding us of that.
And then, if I may add one more thing,
Of course.
to go back to Jason's question, I would also say to this person, well, if you really think it's hopeless and nothing making a difference, what are you doing in my office? In other words, you don't say that to mock them or to criticize them. You say, I know that a big part of you believes that there's no hope, and there's valid reasons for that. But part of you does believe that maybe something is possible, and that part of you is strong enough to have brought you here. So pay attention to that part as well. Okay, that's what I was going to say.
Absolutely. Thank you. Juan, your hand's up, and then Luz after that. Juan?
Thank you so much. I do have a question. What are some of the signs that someone is truly living from their authentic, I would say maybe adult self rather than from their wounded inner child? And how can you distinguish between, those kind of coping mechanisms and healed responses, especially when trauma responses feel like they become so much part of people's identities?
I need to apologize. This is Professor Juan.
Yes.
And I'm sorry. As I saw your complete name, then I noticed you're my dear colleague. Thank you for that. That's absolutely was on my mind to ask also about this notion of trauma informed response, but not seeing a lot of changes. So that's great. You read my mind. Thank you.
Well, you know what? So I'm going to ask Professor Flores Zamora to repeat that question or to rephrase it because I really want to get it. I'm not sure I fully.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how can I tell if someone is truly like myself, truly living from like my adult authentic self.
Are you asking about how does the person themselves tell?
Yeah, and others, how can I tell in others rather than from like their wounded inner child? And especially
Yeah.
since so many coping mechanisms can be negative, how do we figure out if those healed responses are truly just good responses or just trauma responses that have just become part of their identity?
Yeah. Well, what your question implies, quite accurately, I believe, is that people get to identify with their coping mechanisms and they get to identify with their traumatic responses. And I think that's who they are. And identification from the Latin word idem, which means the same, and facere, which means to make. We make ourselves the same as those coping mechanisms, and you think that's who you actually are. But here's where the body comes into it. Because when I work with clients or when I teach my students, we pay a lot of attention to the body. Because intellectually, your question is unanswerable. In other words, there's no way to figure it out intellectually. But the body will tell you. So when I'm coming from myself, I'm in the present, not reacting to the past. I can choose my responses. There's a response flexibility. And there's a kind of relaxation, ease, or comfort in my chest and my belly. When I'm coming from the coping mechanisms, there's always anxiety or unease, bodily discomfort. Number one. So the body will often tell you if you help people pay attention to their bodies. Secondly, if you ask people, have you had the experience of saying something and doing something, and then later on you say to yourself, oh, that wasn't me. A lot of people have had that experience. I wasn't being true to myself there. A lot of people have had that experience. Then you say, who's the one that knows? Who in you recognizes that you weren't being yourself? Well, guess who it is? Your true self. So ask that question. Retrospectively, even if I go to a party and somebody expresses a political opinion and I agree with them just to be nice, or because I'm afraid to express not to be liked, and then later on, oh, I wasn't being myself. Which part of me knows that? Well, the true self. So it's there as we pay attention to it. And then, as I said earlier, then also the body. Pay close attention to the body. It's going to tell you. That's what I can tell you quickly to that question.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Zamora, as well. I have Luz and Georgia's hand, and I think I will end after Georgia. Maybe I have one question myself. Luz, go ahead.
Hi, doctor. Thank you so much for being with us today. I just had a quick question. In the process of trying to reconnect with oneself, especially after trauma or burnout, is there a therapeutic modality or practice you found particularly helpful in restoring that sense of internal safety or clarity?
You know, there are many therapeutic modalities, and I don't think there's one that works for everybody. But any of them, if they're going to work, they have to go beyond the cognitive and behavioral realm and deal with the deep emotional realm and the realm of trauma. So I think that's the common factor to any therapies that, in my mind, have a reasonable chance of working. Now, let me just stand up for a minute. There's a book I want to grab if I can.
Of course.
1 second. Okay. So I'm going to name a bunch of therapies, okay?
Okay.
And I'm not going to recommend any one of them over the others because I don't think we have enough proof, nor do I think there's one that works for everybody. There is Dr. Pat Ogden's sensory motor psychotherapy, okay? Sensory motor, Dr. Ogden, Ogden. There is Lawrence Heller's neuroaffective relational model, NARM. His book is Healing Developmental Trauma. There is Peter Levine's Somatic Experiencing. There's Dr. Dick Schwartz's Internal Family Systems. There's my own method called Compassionate Inquiry that I teach to hundreds of students around the world every year. I'm not going to recommend one over the other because I have no basis to, but I can tell you they can all be very effective. And all of the ones I mentioned and some others do take trauma into it. They're trauma informed. We can also add modalities like brain spotting and EMDR, and there's something called havening. So lots of modalities out there.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Georgia, go ahead.
Hello, thank you, Dr. Mate, for being here with us. So my question is two parts, but they're related. At what part in the healing process do you feel that personal traumas can be addressed without potentially triggering relapse? And do you think that it can be harmful to a person in early recovery who has limited resources and are going to 12-step programs or group therapy and listening to other people sharing about their traumas? Do you feel that that can be triggering to that person again and trigger and potentially trigger relapse?
Well,
thank you.
Peter Levine, who I mentioned, and he's a very well-known psychologist and one of the pioneers of trauma psychology, somatic experiencing is his modality. He talks about titrating the treatment so that you don't do it all at once. You do it in doses that the client can tolerate at any one time. Okay. I have a somewhat different approach. I go there right away. If I sense that the client is safe with me and they're ready for it, because I think actually a lot of people find relief in understanding that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with them. I mean, here's the message. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with you.
I'm sorry, Dr. Mate.
Excuse me, Dr. Mate. That's Andreas. That's your iPhone. Okay, he just muted. So sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. Here's the message. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with you. Everything you think is wrong with you is an outcome or a response to trauma. So you're basically okay. So let's look at some of the things that may have convinced you that you're not. But you basically are. I mean, I'm not giving you words here, I'm giving you an approach. I generally find that people are grateful. Now, I don't push it. If people say, I don't want to go there, we don't go there. But most people express gratitude that somebody's interested enough to look beyond the surface, that somebody doesn't mistake them for their behavior or their demeanor or their life circumstances. As to people being triggered in 12-step groups, well, look, I only wish that the 12-step groups were more trauma-informed. It's kind of interesting to me that here's this movement that was founded by a guy who was abandoned by his parents, Dr. W. And trauma isn't kind of a mandatory or a necessarily conscious part of the program. The 12 steps say nothing about trauma. So it's also not a unitary movement. It's not monolithic. So in some groups, you'll find people talking about their traumas. In some groups, the word never even gets talked about. So But I don't think that in a safe, supportive context where people are supporting each other, anybody's ever going to be pushed into relapse. And if they are, that'd be very rare compared with the good that would be being done if these things were talked about more. So on the whole, I see nothing but benefit here. That's my own personal bias.
Mm. Thank you. It's so informative. If I may, Dr. Maté, now that there are no hands up, there are some other subjects we talk about as we go through many texts, including yours. One of the other people that I have been impacted also, other than yourself and some other wonderful experts out there, is Viktor Frankl and
Yeah.
logotherapy. We talk about how he talks about suffering is unavoidable in life. And it's
Yeah.
only how we try to find the meaning of that suffering. In other words, find what is the purpose of our pain. We talk about that. At times it is hard to think about what was that purpose. For example, especially when, in your work, focusing on childhood trauma and a lot of abuse, childhood abuse. So can you talk about that? How an individual can find purpose out of their pain when it is not only just trauma, but unfair and unjust. I would appreciate an explanation.
Yeah. Well, of course, the Buddha said 2,500 years ago that life is suffering, Birth is suffering, death is suffering, old age is suffering, sickness is suffering, losing what you have is suffering, not getting what you want is suffering. I mean, he talked about this. Viktor Frankl, with all due respect, I read his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He's obviously a very inspired and in some ways great man. I don't think he understood trauma.
No.
I think he was going by his own example. He found meaning in his experience, and he says this is just everybody can do that, logotherapy. Well, I don't think he understood trauma. And I don't have, well, I don't follow his particular way of thinking. No. On the one hand, on the other hand, here's what I can tell you. Like his book is entitled Man's Search for Meaning. People need meaning. Meaning is a need that human beings have. It's just one of our, just as children need food, adults need meaning. And in this society where people are deprived of meaning, look what happens. And when I was working in the downtown east side, it was remarkable to me how often my patients would say, Doc, if I ever get over this, if I ever beat this, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life in making sure that other people don't have to suffer like the way I did. So even in the midst of their misery and their degraded life, if you like, by the standards of this society, they were looking for meaning. And I think people who recover, they find that. So I've found after physical illnesses sometimes, I mean, in the book of the Beta Normal, there's a chapter called Diseases Teacher. I don't recommend disease or addiction as experiences that we should seek out in order to learn from them, obviously. But at the same time, I know so many people who've come through addictions and they found deep meaning in life in their recovery process. So that meaning is there to be found, to be identified, and I think that's available for everybody. And addictions can be an impetus to locate that meaning inside yourself. So I think Frankl is right about that man is searching for meaning, As a modality, logotherapy, I don't think understands trauma very much.
I agree with you. There are components of each application that can be used and some components not applicable. But I have to tell you what you just described about those individuals that in the midst of their going through their their struggles, they were still thinking about, you know, a greater goal. I have to tell you that this is the majority of experiences I had with whether people that in the clinic I was working with or the students, you know, students' resiliency, brilliancy, and how they have made a goal to do what they're doing to go and help others and advocacy. I personally think that when you get out of yourself and start giving and being service, that's one of the biggest healings of that human can find. You know, not just one, but one of them being
Well, you know that famous prayer of Saint Francis, which Saint Francis never said, but somebody probably wrote it a few decades ago, but it's still very compelling. It says, "It is when you give that you receive."
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I do not know how to thank you, Dr. Maté, in absolute gratefulness. I mean, I know I'm not the only one who says we can go on and listen to you, but thank you for your service to the field, to the humanity, and for who you are, and for your generosity, accepting to come to our school and give this presentation. Thank you so much. I
My
appreciate it.
pleasure. Thank you and good night. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maté.
Thank
Muchas
you.
gracias.
Thank you
so much, Dr.
Thank you,
Maté.
doctor.
Appreciate you.
Thank you,
Thank
Annahita
you.
Mahdavi
Good night.
West.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you, Cambridge.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye, Oscar and
Thank you, Dr.
everybody.
Mahdavi.
Thank you guys. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. Have a good one. Nice to see you, Mr. Prince Stewart.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank
Thank you so
you.
much for
Have a
being
good weekend.
here.
Thank you
Bye,
so
guys.
much, Dr. Mahdavi West, for putting this together.
Of course. Thank you. Thanks for being here.
That was
My
amazing.
dear friend Juan, I'm sorry I didn't call you professor at the beginning.
It's
Bye.
okay, no problem.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Mahdavi.
Have a good one.
Thank you, Miss
Bye,
Branch.
Oscar.
Bye, guys. Yeah, bye, Dr. Branch.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Jan. Hi, Jan. Bye, Jan. Bye, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Bye-bye, doctor.
Bye.
Outstanding job, Dr. Mahdavi. Outstanding job. Thank you for the caliber of bringing this to the college. And very bright and wonderful students. So thank you for sharing all of them with us tonight. Take care, all.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Alicia. Thank
God
you.
bless. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.